You would have seen, Tim, because we all have, I suppose, this leaked document or news of this leaked document from the US. It's dated to March the 1st, and it talks about 50 or so British special forces being in Ukraine. Apparently, about half of a contingent of special forces from friendly powers in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's first of all, this leak is obviously very embarrassing to the United States, and it doesn't help us in that in the UK has always taken the line that we never talk about special forces deployments, and I think the government need to keep very quiet about it. And it is a shame that these have been released. Now, having said that, to be honest, it's not a surprise to me. I suppose what could surprise people is that the UK is making up over half of the numbers that were released in these documents. That may or may not be true. It may or may not be the total picture. But I don't think there's any doubt that we would be assisting Ukraine in some shape or form. We're training Ukrainian soldiers, of course, here in the UK. We're providing a lot of military equipment and political and economic support. So, it's not a surprise, but it's a shame that it's come out in these documents.
I mean, you can't help wondering, and I guess we can discuss this without threatening or compromising any operation or any individual. What sort of duty special forces services from this country would be doing in Ukraine? What sort of work would be given to them?
Well, I don't suppose that I doubt that they would be conducting operations, in inverted commas, military operations on their own. I suspect they're involved in helping in terms of security, maybe security in terms of people like the president and other key figures, because they're obviously under threat from Russia, who would be very happy to take out the senior cohort of both military and political figures in Ukraine. I suspect they're helping training on the ground in terms of helping people with special observation and running close observation patrols and so on. But I doubt very much that they're conducting operations on their own, gathering intelligence or whatever. So I suspect it's more behind the lines than that. But beyond that, to be honest, I don't think it's very helpful to talk about it.
Indeed. I mean, I can see why you would say that. And I can also easily imagine that a British government minister or a British serving commander, it's the last thing they'd want to talk about out loud. But equally, I suppose, if we're worrying about the sensitivity of this beyond operational sensitivity, then we can imagine that Russia would be totally unsurprised to hear that there are British and other special forces working in Ukraine with Ukrainian military.
I'm sure that's true. The fact that the documents have been released, of course, does give Russia the ability to talk about NATO being intimately involved in operations inside Ukraine, which NATO has always said, of course, that we don't want to be involved with, which is why we've not put in, air support or ground force support into Ukraine itself. We've supported them from outside the country. So that's why I'm disappointed that these documents have been released and they are, making those sort of indications. These are not large numbers, obviously, but nonetheless, they are a reality, and they're pretty capable guys. So it is a shame, as I say, that this has been made public.
Now, can I just get your thoughts for a moment, Tim, on the issue of Taiwan, which is occupying a lot of time at high political and diplomatic levels? We've seen Emmanuel Macron urging Europe not to get too engaged in the tension between America and China over Taiwan. What's your military perspective on all of this? I mean, what could be done to defend Taiwan? Obviously, I suppose more could be done to help Taiwan defend itself, but is the idea of actively defending Taiwan against a putative Russian attack, is that realistic?
Yes, it's certainly realistic. And there's no doubt that China has made it very clear that they wish to bring Taiwan, in their view, from their perspective, back into main, part of China. And they want to do that by the 100th anniversary of the CCP. So there's, these exercises that we've been seeing are part of a continuous pressure in terms of air violations, naval violations into Taiwan's air and naval space. But this will not be an easy operation. There was a war game actually not that long ago conducted in the US in one of their think tanks, and they war gamed a major attack on Taiwan. And in the end, the Chinese didn't win actually. It was assumed that the US would engage, that Japan would be involved, and other nations to some degree. The Americans were going to take a lot of casualties from this war game, including losing 2 carriers and well over high number of surface ships, but the Chinese were going to take a hammering out of this war game. And it wasn't just one scenario, it was played through over quite a long period of time, looking at various scenarios. To take Taiwan militarily will not be easy. This is not the equivalent of crossing the English Channel. It's a much wider water than that. What is interesting, I think, more for me anyway, is that China could aim to isolate Taiwan. It's been quite aggressive, as we know, in the South China Sea, and these exercises, sending ships and airplanes into Taiwan's space, they could attempt to isolate Taiwan, to sort of try and annex it without using military force. The other thing is that Taiwan is not just one island, of course. It's a lot of islands. I can't remember the exact figure, to be honest, but it's about 130, I think. And some of those islands are quite close to China, as in 12 miles away. So, could China decide to take a couple of those islands, put a footprint there, isolate Taiwan from the international shipping areas and so forth? That I think is a possibility. I don't actually think it's a probability, but I do think it's a possibility. And there's no doubt too that President Macron's comment in that sense is not helpful. American eyes are very firmly on China. They see China as a much greater threat than Russia, and I think they're right, personally. I think I've said it with you before that Russia is like bad weather. China is the equivalent of global climate change, strategically, long term. And the Americans feel very strongly about that. Not just a small clique in Washington. It's widely held throughout the US that China is the long-term threat.
And beyond the US
they've never made it obvious, I think there's no doubt in my mind they would be prepared to assist Taiwan if China did conduct serious military operations.